On April 6, 1250, the most powerful Christian king in Europe knelt in chains before a slave soldier. Louis IX of France, crusader, saint, commander of 20,000 men, had just lost everything. His brother was dead, his army was destroyed, and the men who broke him, 6,000 Mamluk Cavalry who'd been slaves 5 years earlier. Think about those numbers for a second. 6,000 against 20,000. The Crusaders had superior armor, more infantry, siege engines, and a sacred mission blessed by the Pope himself. Yet, by the end of this video, you'll understand how slave soldiers achieved the impossible and killed the age of Crusades forever. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the suicidal cavalry charge that turned certain victory into catastrophic defeat in 17 minutes. Second, the street fighting tactic that made heavy armor a death sentence. And third, the ransom demand so staggering it bankrupted France's treasury. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did former slaves outfight Europe's finest knights? What tactical innovation made Crusader cavalry worthless in Egyptian streets? Why did Louis IX's own commanders beg him to retreat, and why did he refuse? And how did one battle end 150 years of Crusader dominance in the Middle East? To understand how 6,000 men destroyed a king and an era, we need to go back to when Louis IX decided God wanted him to conquer Egypt. December 1244. Louis IX of France lay dying in his palace at Pontoise, burning with fever, his physicians helpless, his court preparing for the worst. He was 30 years old, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, and for 3 days he showed no signs of life. His mother, Blanche of Castile, wept at his bedside. Priests administered last rites. Then, on the 4th day, his eyes opened. He sat up, and the first words out of his mouth changed the course of history. "I am taking the cross." His family thought the fever had broken his mind, but Louis was clear-eyed, absolutely certain, and completely obsessed with one mission: reconquer Jerusalem by invading Egypt and destroying the Ayyubid dynasty at its source. His mother was furious, his advisors were horrified, and they had every reason to be. Louis wasn't just proposing another crusade. He was proposing to repeat the exact strategy that had failed catastrophically 23 years earlier. The Fifth Crusade had invaded Egypt in 1218 with 30,000 men, besieged Damietta for 18 months, captured it, then marched on Cairo and got trapped by Nile floods and Egyptian counterattacks. The entire army surrendered. Damietta was returned for nothing. Thousands died. And Louis wanted to do it again. Here's what made this decision genuinely insane. France was stable, prosperous, and at peace for the first time in decades. Louis had spent 10 years consolidating power, reforming the legal system, building universities, earning a reputation as Europe's most just and capable ruler. He had everything to lose, and Jerusalem, which had been Muslim-controlled since 1244, offered nothing strategic to France. No trade routes, no territorial gain, just religious symbolism and a graveyard filled with Crusader bones. But Louis wasn't thinking strategically. He was thinking theologically. During those 3 days of death fever, he'd apparently experienced visions, divine commands, a certainty that God had spared his life for one purpose: to liberate the Holy Land. And when Louis IX decided God wanted something, human logic became irrelevant. Within weeks, he'd announced his intention publicly. Think about the commitment he was making. A crusade to Egypt would require at minimum 15,000 knights, each with multiple horses, squires, and equipment. Thousands more infantry, crossbowmen, engineers, priests, support staff. The logistics alone transporting that many men and animals across the Mediterranean, supplying them in hostile territory, maintaining siege equipment in Egyptian heat would cost more than France's entire annual revenue. Louis didn't care. He mortgaged royal lands. He imposed new taxes. He borrowed from Italian bankers at ruinous interest rates. His court watched in disbelief as the king they'd praised for wisdom transformed into a religious fanatic willing to bankrupt France for a desert city. But here's what none of them understood yet. Louis wasn't planning a typical crusade, a chaotic mob of glory-seeking nobles fighting over scraps of authority. He was planning something Europe had never seen before, an industrial-scale invasion that would make previous crusades look like armed pilgrimages. And the machine he was about to build would be so devastating, so perfectly organized, that its ultimate failure would shock the entire medieval world and prove that no amount of preparation can overcome tactical stupidity. The question wasn't whether Louis could assemble an unstoppable army. It was whether he could use it properly once he got to Egypt. By 1248, Louis had transformed France into a war machine that would make modern logistics officers weep with envy. This wasn't a ragtag band of glory-seeking nobles, this was industrial-scale crusading. He'd spent 4 years and bankrupted half his kingdom preparing. 36 transport ships commissioned, each capable of carrying 100 horses and their riders. Warehouses in Cyprus packed with enough grain, wine, and salted meat to feed 20,000 men for a year. Mobile forges, siege engineers, Genoese crossbowmen hired by the thousand, and the knights themselves, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, encased in plate armor that could turn arrows like raindrops, mounted on war horses bred for shock combat, trained since childhood in the art of the lance charge. By August 1248, when Louis's fleet sailed from Aigues-Mortes, Christian Europe believed this crusade couldn't fail. The numbers were staggering. Louis brought 2,500 knights from France alone, each one a minor nobleman who'd spent years training, each equipped with armor worth more than a peasant would earn in 10 lifetimes. Add another 5,000 mounted sergeants, lesser cavalry but still professional soldiers. Then 10,000 infantry pikemen, crossbowmen, engineers, plus 2,000 Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries whose accuracy was legendary. Total fighting force. Nearly 20,000 combat-effective troops, the largest crusader army assembled in 40 years. But here's where Louis's obsession with preparation became genuinely revolutionary. Previous crusades had failed because of logistics. Armies ran out of food, supplies never arrived, sieges collapsed because no one brought enough rope or nails or horseshoes. Louis solved that problem through what can only be called medieval supply chain management. He'd purchased the entire island of Cyprus's grain harvest for 1,248. He'd contracted with Venetian and Genoese merchants to maintain supply lines. He'd built a fortified base at Limassol stocked with replacement weapons, armor, horses, everything an army would need. Think about what this meant tactically. A French knight in 1248 was essentially a tank. Full plate armor, helmet, breastplate, gauntlets, greaves weighing 60 pounds but distributed so well a trained man could mount a horse unaided. Beneath that, chainmail covering joints. Beneath that, padded gambeson to absorb impact. A lance 12 feet long, designed to punch through shields at full gallop. A sword as backup. A destrier warhorse that weighed 2,000 pounds and could trample infantry. In a straight charge, nothing on earth could stop them. And Louis had 2,500 of them. Plus the tactical doctrine refined over 150 years of crusading, the massed lance charge that had shattered Muslim armies at Antioch, at Arsuf, at Jaffa. The defensive formations that could hold against numerical superiority. The siege expertise that had captured Jerusalem in 1099, Acre in 1191. On paper, this army was unbeatable. Muslim chroniclers who watched Louis's fleet arrive in Cyprus wrote with genuine fear. Ibn Wasil described ships beyond counting, knights whose armor shone like stars, an army that covered the sea. Mamluk commanders in Egypt received reports and began emergency mobilization. Even Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, dying of tuberculosis in Cairo, knew this wasn't a raid, this was an existential threat. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Louis's army had one critical weakness that no amount of armor or training could fix. They were designed for European warfare, open battlefields, castle sieges, enemies who fought the same way they did. What they were about to face in Egypt was something completely different. An enemy who'd been studying Crusader tactics for 50 years, waiting for exactly this moment, ready to turn every European advantage into a fatal liability. And Louis, for all his preparation, had no idea what was coming. Egypt in 1250 wasn't just wealthy, it was the economic engine of the medieval world. The Nile Delta produced more grain than anywhere else on Earth, feeding North Africa, Arabia, and half the Mediterranean. Control Egypt, and you controlled trade routes from India to Venice, from sub-Saharan Africa to Constantinople. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin himself, ruled from Cairo with an army that had perfected the art of defensive warfare over 50 years of Crusader attacks. But there was a problem the Crusaders didn't understand and wouldn't until it killed them. Egypt's power wasn't in its sultans, it was in the Mamluks, slave soldiers purchased as boys, converted to Islam, and forged into the deadliest cavalry force in the known world. Men with no families, no tribal loyalties, no allegiances except to each other and to jihad. And in 1250, they were about to prove why buying and training warriors from childhood produces something far more dangerous than knights born into privilege. Here's how the system worked. Slave traders would purchase boys, usually Turkic or Circassian, aged 10 to 13 from the Kipchak steppes north of the Black Sea. These children were brought to Cairo and immediately converted to Islam. Then came the training. For the next 10 to 15 years, they learned nothing but war. Horsemanship from age 11, archery drills 6 hours a day, sword combat, lance work, wrestling, unit tactics. By age 25, a fully trained Mamluk could fire 20 arrows per minute from horseback at full gallop with lethal accuracy at 200 yards. They could reload a composite bow in 3 seconds, while controlling a war horse with their knees. They practiced coordinated charges and tactical retreats until they could execute complex maneuvers without verbal commands, just horn signals and battlefield awareness. Think about what that meant compared to European knights. A French nobleman learned to fight, yes, but he also learned estate management, courtly behavior, hunting, falconry, the full range of aristocratic skills. His military training was important but not all-consuming. A Mamluk learned only war. No distractions, no divided loyalties, no inherited lands to worry about. Just combat, every day, for 15 years. By 1250, Egypt's Mamluk Corps numbered roughly 12,000 men. Not all would deploy at once. Garrison duties, border patrols, palace guards absorbed thousands. But the elite units, the royal Mamluks who served directly under the Sultan, represented about 6,000 of the finest trained cavalry in the medieval world. And they'd been waiting for Louis IX since the moment his fleet appeared off Cyprus. Here's where it gets genuinely terrifying from the Crusader perspective. European warfare in 1250 was built around the decisive charge, heavy cavalry smashing into infantry, or lighter cavalry, breaking them through sheer kinetic force. The Mamluks had studied this tactic for half a century. They'd fought Richard the Lionheart. They'd defeated the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Crusades. They knew exactly how European knights fought, and they'd developed doctrine specifically designed to counter it. Don't meet the charge head-on. Scatter. Fire arrows into the knights as they commit. Target the horses easier to hit, just as deadly when they go down. Draw them into pursuits where they spread out and lose formation cohesion. Then counterattack with fresh cavalry against isolated, exhausted knights whose armor becomes a burden in extended combat. It was brilliant. It was proven. And it required discipline, training, and unit cohesion that only a military aristocracy raised from childhood for war could execute. The Mamluks watched Louis's army land at Damietta in June 1249, and they didn't panic. They studied. They waited. They knew something the Crusaders didn't. Egypt's real defense wasn't its walls or its fortresses. It was the terrain, the heat, the diseases, and the logistics of fighting 100 miles from your supply base, while an enemy who knows every village, every canal, every ford, bleeds you with 1,000 cuts. Louis IX was about to learn that conquering a city means nothing if you can't hold the countryside. And the Mamluks were about to teach him that lesson in blood. June 4th, 1249. Louis IX's fleet anchored off Damietta, the fortified port city that guarded Egypt's eastern delta. The Ayyubid garrison watched from the walls, 10,000 strong, knowing this was the same city that had held off the Fifth Crusade for 18 months of brutal siege warfare in 1218. They were confident, prepared, ready to bleed the Crusaders white on the beaches. Then Louis did something insane. He led the first wave himself. Knights in full armor wading through chest-deep water, shields raised against a storm of arrows, hitting the beach and forming ranks while crossbowmen covered their advance. The Muslim defenders, stunned by the speed and discipline, fell back. Within 6 hours, the Crusaders held the beach. Within 2 days, Damietta's garrison panicked and abandoned the city in the night. Louis IX walked into Damietta without a siege, without serious casualties, and with enough supplies to last a year. It was the greatest Crusader victory in a generation. It also guaranteed his destruction, because victories that come too easily make men stupid. Let those numbers sink in. The Fifth Crusade had besieged Damietta from May 1218 to November 1918 months of starvation, disease, and constant assault. Thousands died. The siege towers were burned, mining operations collapsed, and when the city finally fell, it was so devastated that holding it meant nothing. Louis took the same city in 48 hours with losses under 200 men. The garrison simply ran. Muslim chroniclers described it as catastrophic panic. Commanders fled first, soldiers followed, civilians poured out of gates in the darkness, and by dawn on June 6th, Crusader banners flew from walls that should have cost thousands of lives to breach. What the Crusaders found inside was a conqueror's dream. Warehouses stocked with grain, dates, salted fish, enough food for the entire garrison for months, armories filled with weapons, stables with hundreds of horses, a functioning port with ships, piers, and facilities intact. Damietta wasn't just captured, it was gifted to them, complete and ready for occupation. Louis established it as his forward base, moved his supply operations ashore, and settled in to consolidate. Here's where the trap closed without anyone noticing. The garrison's flight wasn't incompetence, it was calculation. Fakhr ad-Din, the Ayyubid commander, had received orders directly from Sultan as-Salih Ayyub in Cairo. Do not defend Damietta to the death. Let them take it. Let them celebrate. Let them believe this will be easy. Because every day the Crusaders spend in Damietta thinking they've won is a day Egypt mobilizes, fortifies Mansoura, and prepares the real defense 100 miles south, where the terrain favors us and their supply lines will be impossibly stretched. Louis didn't see it. His council certainly didn't. They saw a miracle, God delivering them victory without the horror of siege warfare. French knights, who'd expected months of bloody assault, walked through Damietta's streets in awe, claiming houses, requisitioning supplies, writing letters home about the easy conquest. The Templars and Hospitallers, veterans who should have known better, got swept up in the euphoria. But there were a few voices of dissent. Older commanders who'd fought in Egypt before warned Louis, "Take this city and march immediately on Cairo before they recover. Don't sit here. Don't wait. Every day you delay is a day they prepare to destroy you." Louis listened politely and ignored them completely. He wanted reinforcements. He wanted his brother Alphonse to arrive from France with fresh troops. He wanted perfect logistics before advancing, so he waited. And in Cairo, the Mamluks sharpened their blades and smiled. Because the longer Louis stayed in Damietta celebrating his bloodless victory, the easier it would be to drown him in the Nile Delta when he finally decided to move. The trap wasn't Damietta's walls, it was Damietta's ease, and Louis had walked straight into it. Louis did exactly what you'd expect, a 3-5-year-old king, with no military experience and absolute faith in divine providence, to do after an easy victory. He stopped. For 6 months. In Damietta, while the entire Muslim world mobilized against him. His advisors begged him to march immediately on Cairo, 100 miles south, before the Ayyubids could organize. His Templar commanders, men who'd fought in Egypt before, warned him that the Nile floods were coming and would turn the delta into an impassable swamp by August. But Louis wanted to wait for reinforcements from Europe, wanted perfect supply lines, wanted his brother Alphonse to arrive with fresh troops. So he waited in Damietta, building fortifications, holding feasts, writing letters to the Pope about his glorious triumph. Meanwhile, in Cairo, Sultan Salih Ayyub was dying of tuberculosis and paranoia, and the Mamluks, led by a man named Baibars, who would become a legend, were watching the Crusader army sit idle and planning something the Christians would never see coming. The timeline of Louis's delay is staggering. Damietta fell on June 6, 1249. Louis didn't march south until November 20th, 167 days later. Nearly 6 months, sitting in a captured city while the strategic initiative evaporated. Think about what that meant militarily. In June, the Ayyubid dynasty was in chaos. Sultan as-Salih Ayyub was dying. Command structures were uncertain. Egyptian forces were scattered across garrisons. A rapid advance on Cairo might have ended the war before it truly began. The Templar Grand Master, Guillaume de Sonnac, who'd fought in the Fifth Crusade's Egyptian disaster, personally warned Louis. The Nile will flood in August. The delta becomes impassable. March now or wait until November, but if you wait, they will be ready. Louis dismissed him. God had delivered Damietta without bloodshed. God would deliver Cairo the same way. Why rush when reinforcements were coming? Here's what was happening in Cairo while Louis waited. The Mamluks mobilized everything. Garrison troops from Syria, Alexandria, and Upper Egypt were recalled. Fortifications at Mansoura, the city blocking the approach to Cairo, were reinforced with walls, towers, and artillery positions. Supply depots were established. Intelligence networks mapped every possible Crusader route. And most critically, command was consolidating under Mamluk emirs, who'd been preparing for exactly this scenario their entire adult lives. Baibars Bundukdari, the Mamluk emir who would later become sultan, spent those 6 months organizing cavalry raids, studying Crusader tactics, and drilling units in coordinated maneuvers. He'd been purchased from Kipchak slave markets at age 13, trained for 15 years, and fought in every major Egyptian campaign since 1240. Now he was watching a European king make every mistake the Fifth Crusade had made, and then some. By August, the Nile flooded right on schedule, turning roads into mud and making rapid movement impossible until the waters receded in October. Louis watched it happen from Damietta's walls, and apparently decided this was fine. His brother Alphonse finally arrived in late October with 2,500 fresh knights. Louis held a war council, ignored every warning about winter campaigns in the Delta, and gave the order to march. It was November 20th, 1249, 5.5 months wasted. And 100 miles south, at Mansoura, 6,000 Mamluk Cavalry had transformed a city into a killing ground specifically designed to destroy heavy cavalry. They were ready. They were rested. They were waiting. And Louis IX, blessed by God and certain of victory, was marching straight into the trap with an army that had spent half a year getting soft in garrison duty. The Mamluks didn't need to defeat him. They just needed to be patient a little longer. November 20th, 1249. Louis finally gave the order to march south toward Cairo. It should have been a triumphal advance, 20,000 Crusaders, the largest Christian army in Egypt since Richard the Lionheart, moving in disciplined columns with cavalry screening, supply trains protected, siege engines rolling behind. But Egypt wasn't cooperating. The Nile had flooded, turning roads into mud, making resupply by ship the only option. Villages were abandoned, crops burned, wells poisoned. The Ayyubids had learned scorched earth from watching Mongols devastate Persia, and now they were applying those lessons with methodical precision. And then the harassment started. Mamluk cavalry appearing out of nowhere, firing arrows into Crusader columns, vanishing before the knights could respond. Not trying to stop the advance, just making it bleed. By the time Louis reached Mansoura, the fortified city that controlled the approach to Cairo, his men had marched 100 miles through hell and hadn't fought a single decisive battle. That was about to change in the worst way possible. The march took 50 days to cover 100 miles. Think about that. 2 miles per day, average. A healthy man can walk 20 miles per day on good roads. But the Crusaders weren't on good roads. They were slogging through post-flood delta terrain, where every stream had overflowed. Every low point was swamped, and the only solid paths were narrow causeways that forced the army into vulnerable columns. Supply ships following parallel canals became the lifeline, and the Mamluks knew it. December 3rd, the first major supply convoy was ambushed. Mamluk cavalry hit it at dawn, killed the guards, burned the cargo, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. Louis lost 3 days' worth of grain in 20 minutes. December 11th, another raid. This time, they sank 2 supply ships by ramming them with fire barges. December 18th, a foraging party of 300 men went out to search abandoned villages for food. 15 returned. The rest were caught in a Mamluk encirclement and slaughtered. Here's what made the harassment so effective. The Mamluks weren't trying to stop the Crusaders, they were bleeding them dry through exhaustion. Every attack required a response. Knights had to form up, investigate, pursue. But the Mamluks rode lighter, faster horses and knew every escape route. Crusader cavalry and 60 pounds of armor couldn't catch them. So the Christians would waste hours chasing ghosts, while the main column sat exposed, losing time, burning energy, and watching their supplies dwindle. By late December, Louis's army was starting to fracture psychologically. Sleep deprivation set in, no one could rest when raids came at random hours. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Dysentery first, then fevers. The field hospitals filled with men too sick to march but too valuable to abandon. On January 8th, 1250, the Crusader vanguard finally sighted Mansoura's walls across the Bahr es-Saghir Canal. Louis called a halt and surveyed the city through the morning mist. Fortified, garrisoned, positioned on high ground with the canal protecting its northern approach. Behind those walls, 6,000 Mamluk cavalry waited in perfect condition, while Louis's 20,000 men were exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized from 7 weeks of constant harassment. And the Mamluks weren't planning to defend Mansoura. They were planning to use it as bait. Because across that canal, inside those walls, was a killing ground specifically designed for one purpose: to lure European heavy cavalry into terrain where their advantages became liabilities. Louis, staring at Mansoura's walls, had no idea he was looking at his own grave. December 1249, the Crusader army camped across the Bahr es-Saghir Canal from Mansoura, staring at walls they couldn't breach without crossing water the Mamluks controlled. Louis's engineers worked on bridge construction while archers traded volleys across the canal. It was stalemate. Then, Robert of Artois, Louis's younger brother, received intelligence that changed everything a local Bedouin claimed to know of ford, a crossing point upstream where the canal was shallow enough to wade. Robert saw his moment for glory. He was 29, brave to the point of recklessness, hungry to prove he was as great a warrior as his sainted brother, and he had command of the vanguard, 1,500 of the finest knights in France, including the Templars, whose Grand Master, Guillaume de Sonnac, should have known better. On February 8th, 1250, before dawn, Robert led his cavalry across the ford, without orders, without support, without waiting for the main army to be ready. Louis woke to the sound of trumpets and realized his brother had just committed the vanguard to a charge he couldn't support. Here's what makes Robert's decision genuinely insane. The battle plan had been clear. Louis would feint with the main army at the bridge construction site, while Robert's vanguard used the ford to cross and establish a beachhead. Then, And only then, after the position was secured and reinforcements could follow, would they advance on Mansoura. Coordinated, supported, safe. Robert decided coordination was for cowards. At 5:30 a.m., while Louis slept, Robert assembled his knights at the ford. 1,500 cavalry, 300 of his own household knights, 280 Templars under Guillaume de Sonac, another 920 French nobles eager for glory. The Bedouin guide led them to the crossing point, chest-deep water, 40 feet across, current strong but manageable. Robert didn't send scouts ahead to check the far bank, didn't wait for dawn to see what they were riding into, didn't send word back to Louis. He just gave the order. Cross. Now. The knights waded their horses through in darkness, water swirling around stirrups, armor soaked, lances held high. It took 40 minutes to get all 1,500 across. And the moment the last knight cleared the far bank, Robert issued the order that sealed their fate. Charge Mansoura. Take the city before they know we're here. Guillaume de Sonac, the Templar Grandmaster who'd survived the Fifth Crusade's Egyptian disaster, who knew exactly what happened to unsupported cavalry in Muslim cities, tried to object. My lord, we should hold here, secure the crossing, wait for the king. Robert cut him off. The Templars lead the charge, or they stay behind in shame. Choose. The Templars had a reputation to uphold. They chose to charge. Meanwhile, back at the main camp, Louis woke to commotion. Officers rushed to his tent with the news. Robert had crossed. The vanguard was gone. No communication, no coordination. Just 1,500 knights riding toward Mansoura in the pre-dawn darkness against orders. Louis, according to Jean de Joinville's chronicle, went pale. He immediately ordered the main army to prepare for emergency advance. But preparing 18,000 men to cross a canal takes hours. Robert would be at Mansoura's gates in 30 minutes. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The Mamluks knew about the ford. They'd known for weeks. Local intelligence had reported it. Scouts had watched Robert's reconnaissance parties. And inside Mansoura, Baibars and Faris ad-Din Akhtai had prepared something no European cavalry force had ever encountered. Not a defense, a slaughterhouse. And 1,500 French knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, were about to ride straight into it at full gallop, unsupported, with no escape route, believing they were about to win glory. They had 17 minutes left to live. Dawn, February 8th, 1,250, Robert of Artois and 1,500 knights thundered into Mansoura, expecting to find a surprised garrison and an undefended city. What they found was a killing ground. The Mamluks had known about the ford for days. Their intelligence network made the Crusaders look like blind children. They'd let Robert cross. They'd let him charge. And now they were inside the city, waiting. The Crusaders crashed into Mansoura's streets at full gallop, lances leveled, and immediately discovered that heavy cavalry in narrow streets is just expensive infantry that can't maneuver. Mamluk archers on rooftops poured arrows down into horses, and men packed shoulder to shoulder. Side streets erupted with cavalry charges that hit the Crusaders from angles they couldn't defend. Robert's knights tried to form defensive positions, tried to fight their way back out, tried to use their superior armor and training. It didn't matter. In 17 minutes of savage street fighting, the flower of French chivalry was butchered like cattle. Robert of Artois died with an arrow through his face. The Templar Grand Master lost an eye and half his men. Of the 1,500 knights who charged in, fewer than 300 made it out. 6:10 a.m. The first wave of Crusader cavalry hits Mansoura's outer gates. They're open. Not broken down, open. Inviting. Robert should have recognized the trap. Instead, he sees confirmation that speed and surprise have worked. He leads his household knights straight into the city's main avenue, expecting to reach the citadel, capture it, and force a surrender before the garrison can organize. What he doesn't see is Baybars watching from a rooftop 200 yards ahead, giving hand signals to commanders positioned throughout the city. The Mamluks have divided Mansoura into kill zones. Every intersection, every alley, every rooftop has assigned units. They're not defending the city. They're using it as a weapon. 6:12 a.m. The Crusader column is 400 yards into the city when the first volley hits. Mamluk archers on rooftops positioned 3 stories up where cavalry can't reach them fire straight down into the packed knights below. Arrows punch through horses' necks, riders' shoulders, the gaps in armor at joints and necks. A warhorse in full gallop that takes an arrow doesn't just stop it, crashes, throwing its rider, blocking the street, creating chaos. Within 30 seconds, the Crusader advance stalls as wounded horses thrash and dying knights try to stand in 60 pounds of armor. Then the side streets erupt. Mamluk Cavalry light, fast, mounted on horses bred for urban combat charge from alleys at perpendicular angles, hitting the Crusader flanks with lances and scimitars. The French knights try to wheel their destriers to meet the charges, but there's no room. They're packed shoulder to shoulder in a street 20 feet wide. Maneuver is impossible. Defense is impossible. 6:15 Robert realizes they're trapped and orders a fighting retreat. Too late. The Mamluks have closed the gates behind them. Every exit is blocked. Every rooftop has archers. Every intersection has cavalry waiting. The Crusaders try to form a defensive circle, the standard European response to encirclement. In open ground, it's unbreakable. In Mansoura's streets, it just makes them stationary targets. 6:20 a.m. Robert of Artois takes an arrow through his cheek that punches out the back of his skull. He dies instantly, falling from his horse into a street now slick with blood and horse entrails. Guillaume de Sonnac, trying to rally the Templars, catches a blade across his face that takes his left eye. He keeps fighting, blind on one side, shouting orders no one can hear over the screaming. 6:27 a.m. It's over. Of 1,500 knights who charged into Mansoura, 1,200 are dead or dying. The survivors, fewer than 300, break through a weakly defended gate and flee back toward the ford, arrows chasing them every step. And 5 miles north, Louis IX receives the worst news a king can hear. Your brother is dead, your vanguard is destroyed, and the Mamluks are coming. By 9 a.m., Louis IX knew his brother was dead, and his vanguard was destroyed. By 10 a.m., the Mamluks poured out of Mansoura like hornets, and suddenly the Crusaders weren't besieging a city, they were defending their own camp from an enemy that moved faster, hit harder, and knew the terrain better than any European force could match. This was the moment when medieval warfare's fundamental assumption broke. Knights in full plate armor, riding destriers bred for power, should dominate any battlefield through sheer kinetic force. But the Mamluks weren't playing that game. They rode lighter, faster horses. They used composite bows that could punch through mail at 200 yards. They attacked, retreated, attacked again before the Crusaders could respond. And they'd been training for this exact scenario since childhood. Not how to win glorious charges, but how to destroy heavier, slower enemies through mobility and discipline. Louis's knights tried to countercharge. Useless. The Mamluks scattered, regrouped, and came back. By nightfall, the Crusaders were trapped in their own fortified camp, surrounded and bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The Mamluk counterattack came in waves. First wave at 10:15 a.m., 2,000 cavalry, emerging from Mansoura's gates in disciplined formation, not charging wildly but moving in coordinated units with clear objectives. They swept around the Crusader positions, firing arrows, probing defenses, forcing Louis to commit troops to multiple threatened points simultaneously. Second wave at 11 a.m., another 1,500 cavalry hitting the Crusader left flank where Robert's destroyed vanguard had left a gap. Third wave at noon, fresh troops rotating in while the first wave pulled back to rest and rearm. Think about what this meant tactically. The Crusaders had maybe 15,000 effectives left after Mansoura's slaughter, still numerical superiority. but they were operating from static defensive positions while the Mamluks controlled movement and tempo. European warfare doctrine said, "Form heavy cavalry, charge, break the enemy line through shock impact." The Mamluks simply refused to provide a line to break. They moved, fired, withdrew before contact, then attacked from a different angle. Here's where it gets genuinely devastating. Crusader knights in full armor could fight for maybe 20 minutes in Egyptian heat before exhaustion set in. The armor that made them nearly invulnerable also made them slow, hot, and energy inefficient. Mamluk cavalry in lighter gear could fight for hours. They rotated fresh units every 30 minutes, while Crusader knights, once committed, had to stay engaged until the threat passed. By mid-afternoon, Louis' cavalry was physically spent while the Mamluks looked barely winded. At 2 p.m., Louis tried a counterattack. He massed 800 knights, nearly half his remaining heavy cavalry, and sent them in a coordinated charge at a Mamluk formation, harassing his supply lines. The Mamluks saw them coming from a mile away. They scattered. The Crusader knights, lances leveled, thundered through empty ground and pulled up confused. Before they could reform, Mamluk horse archers hit them from 3 sides, firing volleys into the now dispersed knights. 40 Crusaders died. The rest retreated. The Mamluks suffered 0 casualties. Jean de Joinville, Louis' chronicler who was present at the battle, wrote, "They came at us like wasps. We struck at them with swords and lances but could not catch them. They fired arrows that killed our horses and wounded our men, then vanished like demons before we could close." By 4 p.m., Louis understood his situation with horrifying clarity. He couldn't advance. Mansoura was a death trap. He couldn't retreat. The Mamluks controlled all routes back to Damietta. He couldn't fight effectively. His tactical doctrine was useless against an enemy that refused to engage on his terms. All he could do was fortify the camp and hope reinforcements arrived from Damietta before supplies ran out. The Mamluks settled into siege positions around the Crusader camp and waited. They didn't need to storm the fortifications. Time, hunger, and disease would do their work for them. And Louis IX, the most powerful Christian king in Europe, sat in his tent and counted the days until his army started starving. February 9th through March 1250. The Crusaders experienced something no Christian army had endured since the Battle of Hattin. They were besieged in enemy territory with no relief coming. Louis' supply lines ran back 100 miles to Damietta, through hostile country now swarming with Mamluk raiders. Ships trying to resupply up the Nile were sunk or captured. Disease spread through the overcrowded camps. Dysentery killed more men than combat. And every few days, the Mamluks would probe the defenses, test the Crusader perimeter, kill a few dozen men, and retreat before any counterattack could form. Louis tried to negotiate. The Mamluks demanded the surrender of Damietta just to start talks. Louis tried to break out. The Mamluks closed every route. Louis prayed for reinforcements from Europe. None came. By late March, the most powerful Christian king in the world was trapped in a fortified camp in Egypt, watching his army starve, waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. The supply situation collapsed with terrifying speed. February 15th, last major resupply convoy reaches the camp. 3 ships carrying grain, salted meat, and wine. Enough for 2 weeks if rationed carefully. February 20th, rations cut by half. Men receive 1 meal per day. February 28th, rations cut again. Soldiers boil leather straps to extract any nutrition. March 5th, no food left except what individual soldiers had hoarded. Knights who'd ridden to Egypt in gleaming armor started slaughtering their own war horses for meat. Think about what that meant. A destrier war horse represented 5 years of breeding, training, and care. It cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime, and Crusader knights were butchering them out of desperation, knowing that without horses they were just infantry in armor too heavy to fight effectively on foot. By mid-March, over 2,000 horses had been killed for food. The cavalry that had terrorized the Muslim world for 150 years was becoming an army of starving men in expensive metal shells. But the real killer wasn't hunger, it was disease. Dysentery spread through the overcrowded camps where sanitation had collapsed completely. Men too weak to walk to latrines relieved themselves where they slept. Contaminated water supplies spread infection. Jean de Joinville described the horror. The flesh of our gums rotted and fell away. We could not eat. The stench of the sick tents made strong men vomit. Each morning we counted the dead 50, then 80, then 100 per day. Let those numbers sink in. 100 deaths per day from disease alone, not combat. Over 30 days in March. That's 3,000 men dead from dysentery, typhus, and starvation. Louis's army was evaporating without the Mamluks needing to attack. March 12th, Louis attempts a breakout. He masses his remaining effective cavalry, maybe 600 knights still capable of fighting, and tries to punch through the Mamluk encirclement toward Damietta. The Mamluks simply open a corridor, let the Crusaders advance half a mile, then close behind them, and attack from all sides. The breakout collapses within an hour. 70 knights die. The rest retreat to camp. Baybars watches from high ground and doesn't even commit his reserves. March 20th, Louis tries negotiation. He sends envoys to the Mamluk commanders offering terms, a truce, withdrawal to Damietta, even a substantial payment. The Mamluk response is blunt: surrender Damietta immediately, and we'll discuss whether to execute you or ransom you. Otherwise, wait until your army dies. Louis refuses. He's a king. Kings don't surrender cities without a fight. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. By late March, Louis didn't have an army anymore. He had 12,000 sick, starving men trapped in a fortified camp with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no options. The Mamluks had achieved something unprecedented. They'd besieged a besieging force and won without storming the fortifications. And now Louis faced a choice no Christian king had faced in living memory: stay and watch his men die slowly, or retreat and watch them die quickly. Either way, the Seventh Crusade was about to end in catastrophe. November 1249, in Cairo, Sultan as-Salih Ayyub died of tuberculosis, his body racked with fever, his dynasty on the edge of collapse. His death should have been a disaster for Muslim Egypt. Successions were violent, bloody affairs, and the Crusaders were 50 miles away with 20,000 men. But Ayyub's widow, Shajar al-Dur, was not a woman who let inconvenient things like her husband's death interfere with winning wars. She hid the body, forged the Sultan's signature on military orders, and kept the entire government functioning as if Ayyub were still alive while she consolidated power. Meanwhile, command of the Egyptian forces passed to Faris ad-Din Akhtai and a young Mamluk emir named Baybars Bundukdari, the crossbow bearer, who'd been purchased as a slave from the Kipchak steppes at age 13 and trained for 15 years to be a killing machine. Baybars looked at Louis IX's starving, diseased army and realized something the Crusaders hadn't grasped yet. This wasn't about defeating them in battle anymore. It was about waiting until they were so weak that destroying them would be effortless. Here's what made Shajar al-Dur's deception genuinely brilliant. She kept the Sultan's death secret for 80 days. 80 days. During the most critical phase of the war. Servants who prepared the body were sworn to silence on pain of death. The Sultan's meals were still delivered to his chambers. Documents still emerged with his seal. Military commanders received orders from the Sultan that were actually written by Shajar al-Dur and Akhtai. The entire court, the army, even most of the government believed Ayyub was simply too sick to appear publicly. Think about the risk she was taking. In Islamic Egypt, 1250, a woman exercising political power was unprecedented. If the deception failed, if commanders discovered the Sultan was dead and no legitimate heir had been designated, the dynasty would fracture into civil war. Egypt would collapse. The Crusaders would win by default. Shajar al-Dur gambled everything on the calculation that keeping the government stable until the Crusader threat was eliminated mattered more than following succession protocols. And it worked. While Louis IX sat in Damietta wasting 6 months, Shajar al-Dur was consolidating Mamluk loyalty, securing the treasury, and ensuring that when Ayyub's death was finally announced, the transition would be smooth. By February 1250, when the Mamluks destroyed Robert of Artois at Mansoura, effective command had already passed to men who'd been slaves a decade earlier. Baybars Bundukdari was 27 years old in 1250. He'd been purchased from Mongol slave traders who'd captured him during raids on Kipchak settlements north of the Caspian Sea. Tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, unusual for Egypt, with a cataract in one eye that gave him a distinctive appearance. He'd spent 15 years training in Cairo's Mamluk barracks, rising through ranks based purely on tactical genius and battlefield performance. By 1249, he commanded 1,500 royal Mamluks, the elite corps. Here's where Baybars showed why slave soldiers made better commanders than hereditary nobles. He had no political ambitions yet that would come later. In February 1250, his only objective was destroying the Crusaders using the most efficient method possible. And efficiency meant patience. After Mansoura's slaughter, he advised the Mamluk Council, "Don't storm their camp, don't waste lives on assaults, cut their supplies, let disease do our work. Wait until they're so weak they can't fight, then destroy them when retreat becomes their only option." It was cold, calculated, and perfectly logical. The Mamluks had numerical parity, roughly 6,000 cavalry against Louis's remaining 12,000 effectives. But those 12,000 were starving and sick. Every day they waited, the Crusaders got weaker. Every day the Mamluks got stronger, as reinforcements arrived from Syria and Upper Egypt. March 1250. Baybars watches from high ground as the Crusader camp deteriorates. Scouts report 100 deaths per day from disease, horses slaughtered, morale collapsing. He gives orders to his cavalry commanders: maintain the siege, harass supply attempts, but don't commit to major engagement. And when they finally try to retreat, because they will hit them when they're most vulnerable, on the march, exhausted, desperate. That's when we end this. April 5th, 1250. Louis finally gave the order his commanders had been begging for since February: retreat to Damietta. It was too late. His army was barely functional. Thousands were sick with dysentery. Horses were slaughtered for meat weeks ago. Discipline was fraying, but they had no choice: stay and starve, or march and maybe reach Damietta's supplies in safety. The withdrawal began at dawn, a fighting retreat that immediately became a nightmare. The Mamluks had spent 2 months studying Crusader tactics, learning their patterns, waiting for this exact moment. As the Crusaders pulled back from their camp, Mamluk Cavalry hit them from 3 sides simultaneously, not charging to break through, just harassing, killing stragglers, forcing the Christians to move faster, break formation, panic. Louis tried to maintain order, tried to keep his remaining knights as a rear guard. But you can't maintain discipline when half your men are sick, starving, and watching their friends die every 100 yards. By afternoon, the retreat had become a rout. By evening, it was a massacre. The army that began the retreat numbered roughly 12,000 men, what remained of the 20,000 who'd landed at Damietta 10 months earlier. Of those 12,000, maybe 5,000 were combat effective. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weak from starvation they could barely walk. Louis organized them into a column: sick and wounded in the center, infantry on the flanks, remaining cavalry, perhaps 400 mounted knights, as rear guard. The plan was simple: march 100 miles to Damietta, fight off attacks, maintain formation, survive. 6 a.m. The retreat begins. The Crusaders abandon their fortified camp and start moving north along the Nile's eastern bank. Within an hour, Mamluk scouts report the movement to Baybars. He gives immediate orders: let them get 5 miles from camp, then hit them. 9:30 a.m. The Crusader column is stretched over 2 miles too long to defend effectively, moving at the pace of the slowest sick men. Mamluk Cavalry appears on both flanks. 2,000 riders moving parallel to the Christian column, just out of crossbow range. They're not attacking yet, just watching, waiting. The psychological effect is devastating. Every crusader knows what's coming and can do nothing to stop it. 10:15 a.m. The first attack. Mamluk horse archers sweep in from the left flank, fire volleys into the column's center where the sick are concentrated, then withdraw before Crusader knights can respond. 50 men drop. The column keeps moving because stopping means dying. Louis, riding with the vanguard, receives reports. Men falling. Formations breaking. Panic spreading. He sends orders to the rear guard. Hold them off. Maintain discipline. But orders don't stop arrows. Noon. The attacks intensify. Mamluks hit from both sides now. Coordinated strikes every 20 minutes. Fire arrows. Kill stragglers. Retreat. Regroup. Attack again. The Crusader column starts shedding men like a wounded animal bleeding. Soldiers too sick to keep pace fall behind. Mamluk Cavalry cuts them down. No prisoners, no mercy. Here's where it becomes genuinely horrifying. The Crusaders can't fight back effectively because they can't stop moving. If they halt to form defensive positions, the entire column stalls and becomes a stationary target. If they keep marching, the rear guard gets overwhelmed. Louis is trapped between two impossible choices, so he makes the only choice he can: keep moving. Accept the losses. Pray they reach Damietta before the army disintegrates completely. 2 p.m. The rear guard collapses. 400 knights who'd held off Mamluk harassment all morning finally break under sustained assault. Some try to surrender. Most are killed. The Crusader column now has no rear defense. Mamluk cavalry pours into the gap, attacking the main column from behind. Panic spreads like wildfire. Men drop weapons and run. Officers shout orders no one follows, and Louis IX, somewhere in the chaos, realizes he's not going to reach Damietta. He's not even going to survive the day. April 6th, 1250. Dawn broke over the Nile Delta near the village of Fariskour, and Louis IX's army, what was left of it, was surrounded. 6,000 Mamluk cavalry in disciplined formation. Fresh, well-fed, moving with the precision of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. Against them, maybe 8,000 Crusaders still able to fight, exhausted, starving, half of them sick, their armor rusted, their horses dead or dying. The numbers weren't even close anymore. The Mamluks didn't charge immediately. They waited. They let the Crusaders see the circle tightening, let them understand there was no escape, no reinforcements, no miracle coming. Then they attacked. Not a wild cavalry charge, a coordinated assault from all sides that collapsed the Crusader line in minutes. Knights threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Infantry ran and were cut down. Louis IX, sword in hand, tried to rally a final defense and was pulled from his horse, bleeding from a wound to his face. By noon, it was over. The King of France was a prisoner. His surviving nobles were in chains. The Seventh Crusade had ended in the most complete Christian defeat since Hattin, and it had taken the Mamluks one morning to finish it. The Crusaders had reached Fariskour the previous evening after 30 hours of continuous fighting retreat. Of the 12,000 who'd left the camp near Mansoura, fewer than 8,000 survived to see dawn. The rest died on the march, cut down by Mamluk cavalry, collapsed from exhaustion, or simply disappeared into the Egyptian night. Louis's commanders begged him to surrender during the night. He refused. Kings don't kneel before slave soldiers. 5:30 a.m. Dawn light reveals the Mamluk positions. 6,000 cavalry arranged in a perfect encirclement, 3 deep, covering every direction. Baybars commands the northern block, the route toward Damietta. Aktai holds the south. Other emirs control east and west. The circle is maybe 400 yards in diameter. Inside it, 8,000 Crusaders in a defensive formation that would be impressive if they had the strength to maintain it. 6 a.m. Baybars gives the signal. Mamluk Cavalry begins advancing from all sides simultaneously, not charging, walking their horses forward, closing the circle, tightening the noose. Crusader crossbowmen fire. Some Mamluks fall. Not enough. The advance continues, methodical, professional, unstoppable. 6:15 a.m. The circle has compressed to 200 yards. Now the Mamluks charge. 2,000 cavalry hit the Crusader perimeter from 4 directions at once. The sound is catastrophic, horses screaming, metal on metal, men shouting in French, Arabic, Frankish, all drowned out by the thunder of hooves on packed earth. Think about what the Crusaders are facing. They're infantry now, their horses are dead. They're sick, half can barely stand. They're starving, no food for days. And they're being hit by cavalry specifically trained to destroy heavy infantry. The outcome isn't in doubt. The only question is how long they can last. 6:30 a.m. The Crusader line breaks. Not everywhere at once, sections collapse individually. The eastern flank goes first, overwhelmed by coordinated Mamluk charges. Then, the southern position. Men throw down weapons and raise hands in surrender. Some are taken prisoner. Most are killed on the spot. 6,000 Mamluks can't process 8,000 prisoners mid-battle. 7 a.m. Louis IX is still fighting. He's surrounded by maybe 200 knights, his household guard, the last men loyal enough or stubborn enough to die for their king. They've formed a circle around him, shields locked, swords out. Mamluk cavalry surrounds them but doesn't attack. Baybars rides forward and shouts in French, "Surrender the king and you live. Fight and you all die." The knights look at Louis. Louis, bleeding from a sword cut across his face, looks back. And for the first time in 10 months, the sainted king who'd believed God would deliver him victory understands he's lost everything. At 7:15 a.m., Louis IX lowers his sword and kneels. The King of France is now a prisoner of men who'd been slaves a decade earlier. And the ransom they're about to demand will make his military defeat look merciful by comparison. Louis IX sat in chains in a Mamluk prison in Mansoura, and the negotiations for his release began with a demand that made even hardened negotiators go pale: 800,000 bezants. In modern terms, roughly $200 million. Plus, the immediate surrender of Damietta and every Crusader fortress between there and Acre. The ransom wasn't just about money, it was about humiliation. Make the most powerful Christian king in the world admit that his God couldn't save him. Make him pay so much that France would be bankrupted. Make the entire Crusader project look like a naive, doomed enterprise. Louis's advisors begged him to negotiate. The Mamluks wouldn't budge. Every day in captivity, more Crusader prisoners died from wounds, disease, or outright execution. Louis eventually agreed to everything. The ransom was paid in stages first. Damietta was surrendered. Then 400,000 bezants in cash that cleaned out France's entire Egyptian treasury. The remaining 400,000 was paid over years, draining royal coffers and requiring new taxes that made Louis deeply unpopular at home. On May 6, 1250, after 30 days as a prisoner, Louis IX was released. He sailed to Acre, spent 4 more years in the Holy Land, trying to salvage something from the disaster, and finally returned to France in 1254, a broken man who'd watched his brother die and his crusade burn. April 7th, 1250, the day after Farescourt, Mamluk negotiators visited Louis's cell. They presented their terms with cold precision: 800,000 bezants for the king. Damietta surrendered immediately and intact. All Crusader prisoners released only after full payment. Non-negotiable. Louis's chief negotiator, Geoffrey de Sergines, did the math and went pale. 800,000 bezants was more than France's annual royal revenue. It was enough to fund 3 crusades. It was a sum designed to be impossible. Here's what made the demand truly devastating. The Mamluks also held 12,000 Crusader prisoners, nobles, knights, infantry, everyone captured at Farescourt and during the retreat. and they made it clear. Refuse the terms, and we execute them all. To prove they weren't bluffing, on April 10th, they brought 300 prisoners to a field outside Mansoura and beheaded them while Louis watched from his cell window. The message was clear. Agree or watch your men die by the thousand. April 15th. Louis agreed to everything. He had no choice. But the payment process became its own humiliation. First, Damietta had to be surrendered. The city Louis had taken in 48 hours, the city he'd sat in for 6 months believing God had delivered it to him, was handed back to the Mamluks without a fight. The Crusader garrison marched out on April 30th, and Mamluk soldiers marched in. 10 months of crusading, 12,000 Christian dead, and Egypt lost nothing. Then came the money. The first installment, 400,000 bezants, was due immediately. Louis's treasurer assembled every coin in the Crusader treasury. They scraped together 370,000 bezants, still 30,000 short. The Templars had funds, their orders' reserves, stored in Acre. Louis begged them for a loan. The Templars refused. They answered to the Pope, not the King of France. In the end, Louis's men physically broke into the Templar treasury and seized 30,000 bezants by force. The Templars never forgave him. May 6th, 1250. Louis IX, King of France, walks out of Mamluk captivity. He's lost 40 pounds. The wound on his face has scarred. He's aged a decade in 1 month. And he's technically still in debt for 400,000 bezants, a sum that will take years to pay and will require new taxes across France that will make his subjects curse his name. But here's what the chronicles don't fully capture. Louis didn't go home. He sailed to Acre and spent 4 more years in the Holy Land, trying desperately to negotiate alliances, rebuild Crusader defenses, and salvage anything from the disaster. 4 years of diplomatic failure, while France paid his ransom and his mother ruled in his absence. When he finally returned in 1254, he was a shell of the confident young king who'd sailed for Egypt believing God had chosen him to liberate Jerusalem. And the Mamluks who'd broken him were just getting started. The Battle of Mansoura and Fariscour didn't just kill 12,000 Crusaders, it killed the myth that European heavy cavalry was invincible. For 150 years, since the First Crusade, Christian knights believed their superior training, equipment, and fighting spirit made them unstoppable. Hattin in 1187 had been a disaster, but it could be explained away: terrible leadership, bad terrain, overwhelming numbers. Mansoura was different. This was 20,000 Crusaders with everything they needed, led by a king, blessed by the Pope, fighting for the most sacred cause in Christendom. And 6,000 former slave soldiers destroyed them using tactics, discipline, and mobility that turned European advantages into liabilities. The psychological impact rippled across Europe. Knights who'd survived Egypt returned with stories of enemies who wouldn't stand and fight, who used bows instead of lances, who made armor a burden instead of protection. The next generation of Crusades, the 8th, the 9th, were smaller, more cautious, led by men who'd heard what happened to Louis IX and didn't want to repeat his mistakes. Jean de Joinville, who survived and chronicled the disaster, wrote descriptions that terrified European courts. They moved like demons on horseback. We charged and struck empty air. They fired arrows from distances our crossbows could not match. Our armor, which had protected us at Acre and Arsuf, became ovens that cooked us alive in Egyptian heat. When we dismounted to fight on foot, we could barely move under the weight. Think about what that meant for military doctrine. For 150 years, the Crusader playbook was simple. Heavy cavalry charge breaks enemy formations. Infantry mops up. Fortresses provide defensive strongpoints. Mansoura proved that playbook was obsolete against enemies who'd spent generations developing counter-tactics. The Mamluks had turned Crusader strengths into fatal weaknesses. Armor became a heat liability. Heavy horses became slow targets. The decisive charge became a trap. Here's where it gets genuinely significant. The casualty figures tell the story. First Crusade, 1,099. 12,000 Crusaders conquered Jerusalem against 40,000 defenders. 7th Crusade, 1,250. 20,000 Crusaders, destroyed by 6,000 Mamluks without taking a single major objective. The ratios had inverted completely. What had changed? Not European equipment or training knights in 1250 were better armed and armored than their 1,099 counterparts. What changed was the enemy had learned and adapted, while European tactics stayed frozen in time. The survivors brought back trauma that changed recruitment. Knights who'd fought at Mansoura told stories that made younger nobles reconsider taking the cross. They described Mamluk Cavalry appearing from nowhere, firing 20 arrows per minute with lethal accuracy, vanishing before engagement. They described street fighting where heavy armor became a death sentence. They described starvation, disease, and watching the most powerful king in Europe kneel in chains before former slaves. 1,270. Louis IX launched the 8th Crusade, his second attempt. He brought 10,000 men, half the size of the 7th Crusade. He died of dysentery in Tunis before fighting a single battle. 1,271. Prince Edward of England arrived in Acre with 1,000 knights, negotiated a truce, and went home. No one attempted another major crusade to Egypt or Jerusalem. The numbers are stark. Between 1,095 and 1,250, there were 7 major crusades involving 10,000 plus troops. Between 1,250 and 1,291, there were 2, both failed disasters. Mansoura didn't just defeat one army, it broke the will of an entire civilization to keep trying. But here's what the chronicles don't fully capture. While European nobles were learning to fear the Mamluks themselves were undergoing a transformation that would make them even more dangerous. The slave soldiers who destroyed Louis IX were about to do something unprecedented in Islamic history: seize power for themselves and create a military state that would dominate the Middle East for 250 years. And the man leading that transformation was the same commander who'd orchestrated the slaughter at Mansoura. Baybars was just getting started. Within months of Louis's capture, the Mamluk emirs who destroyed the 7th Crusade made a decision that would reshape Middle Eastern history. They murdered the Ayyubid dynasty's last sultan and took power themselves. Shajar al-Dur, the widow who'd held Egypt together during the crisis, was proclaimed sultana, the only woman to rule Egypt in the Islamic period. Her reign lasted 80 days before the Mamluks installed one of their own, Aybak, as sultan. And from 1,250 to 1,517, for 267 years, Egypt was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, a government of former slaves who'd bought and trained new slaves to replace them, creating a military aristocracy unlike anything Europe had seen. Baybars, the commander who'd orchestrated the street fighting at Mansoura, became sultan in 1260 and spent the next 17 years systematically destroying every Crusader fortress from Antioch to Acre. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold fell. The era of Christian control in the Holy Land was over, and it ended because slave soldiers proved they were better at war than anyone else. May 1250, less than a month after Louis's ransom, the Mamluks made their move. The Ayyubid heir, Turan Shah, arrived from Damascus to claim his father's throne. He immediately tried to replace Mamluk commanders with his own loyalists, men who hadn't just saved Egypt from the Crusaders. Fatal mistake. On May 2nd, during a banquet, Baybars and 6 other Mamluk emirs stormed Turan Shah's tent and hacked him to death with swords. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin himself, ended in a pool of blood. The slave soldiers who'd been purchased as children now controlled the wealthiest state in the Muslim world. Here's what made the Mamluk system genuinely revolutionary. In European feudalism, power passed through bloodlines. Nobles inherited titles, land, and authority. In the Mamluk Sultanate, power was earned through military competence alone. You couldn't inherit the Sultanate. Every new sultan was a former slave who'd risen through ranks by proving himself in combat. When a sultan died, the Mamluk emirs elected his replacement from among themselves, usually the most capable military commander. It created a government where the ruling class had literally no connection to Egypt except their training and their loyalty to the system that had elevated them. The results were terrifying for the Crusaders. 1,260. Baybars becomes sultan after defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut, stopping the same Mongol invasion that had destroyed Baghdad. 1,265. Baybars captures Caesarea and Arsuf, two major Crusader fortresses. 1,268. He takes Antioch, one of the four original Crusader states, after a siege that kills 17,000 Christians. The city had stood for 170 years. Baybars razed it so completely it was never rebuilt. Between 1,265 and 1,271, Baybars personally commanded 38 military campaigns. 38. He didn't just conquer Crusader fortresses, he systematically eliminated them. Jaffa, Beaufort, Safed, Croc des Chevaliers. Legendary castles that had held off Muslim armies for generations fell to Mamluk sieges using tactics, engineering, and relentless pressure that European defenders couldn't match. Think about the timeline. 1099. First Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. 1250. Mamluks destroy the Seventh Crusade. 1291. Last Crusader fortress falls. From Mamluk victory to total Crusader expulsion took just 41 years. And it was methodical, professional extermination executed by men who'd been trained since childhood for exactly this purpose, destroying enemies of Islam through superior warfare. By 1291, when Acre fell and the last Crusaders were driven into the Mediterranean, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was gone. 2 centuries of Christian presence in the Holy Land erased by a military aristocracy of former slaves. And it all traced back to one February morning in 1250, when 6,000 Mamluk Cavalry proved that discipline, mobility, and tactical innovation could destroy the most powerful army in Christendom. The Seventh Crusade's failure did more than end Louis IX's military career, it ended the crusading movement's credibility. The Fourth Crusade had sacked Constantinople in 1204, dividing Christian against Christian. The Fifth had failed in Egypt in 1221. The Sixth had succeeded only through diplomacy. Now the Seventh, led by the most powerful and pious king in Europe, had ended in catastrophic defeat and bankruptcy. Crusading became something kings talked about to seem holy, not something they actually did. When Louis launched the Eighth Crusade in 1270, he died of dysentery in Tunis before fighting a single battle. No one tried again with serious force. The Mamluks had adapted, evolved, and developed tactics specifically designed to destroy heavy cavalry. And by 1291, when Acre fell and the last Crusaders were driven into the sea, the maps were redrawn permanently. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had lasted 192 years, was gone. In its place, the Mamluk Sultanate, which would rule Egypt until the Ottomans conquered them in 1517. The Crusades didn't end with a climactic final battle. They ended with a French king kneeling in Egyptian chains, paying a ransom that broke his kingdom, and sailing home to explain how 6,000 former slaves had killed the dream of a Christian Holy Land forever. The financial damage was catastrophic and permanent. France paid 800,000 bezants over 4 years, roughly equivalent to 6 years of royal revenue. To raise the money, Louis imposed new taxes that sparked revolts. He seized church property. He borrowed from Italian bankers at interest rates that compounded into decades of debt. When he died in 1270, France was still paying for the Seventh Crusade's failure. Think about that. 20 years later, the kingdom was still financially crippled by one disastrous campaign. But here's what made the defeat truly devastating. Louis IX was canonized in 1297, declared Saint Louis for his piety, justice, and devotion to Christ. He's still venerated as the model Christian king. Yet his 2 crusades killed over 15,000 French knights, bankrupted the kingdom, and accomplished nothing. The 8th Crusade in 1270 was even worse than the 7th. Louis died of dysentery in Tunis on August 25th, without conquering anything or fighting anyone. His son, Philip III, immediately negotiated withdrawal and sailed home. The crusading ideal had become a death sentence wrapped in religious propaganda. Meanwhile, the Mamluks methodically erased Christian presence from the Levant. 1268. Antioch falls. 1271. Croix des Chevaliers, the greatest crusader fortress ever built, surrenders after a siege. 1289. Tripoli falls. 1291. Acre, the last major crusader stronghold, falls after a 6-week siege that kills 30,000 Christians. On May 18, 1291, the last crusaders evacuated by ship while Mamluk troops poured through breached walls. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099, was gone. Here's what the chronicles won't tell you. The Mamluks didn't just defeat the Crusades militarily, they defeated them conceptually. They proved that tactical innovation beats traditional superiority. That mobility and discipline trump armor and tradition. That wars are won through adaptation, not adherence to doctrine. European knights in 1250 fought exactly like their grandfathers in 1150. Mamluk Cavalry in 1250 had evolved specifically to counter those tactics. The result was inevitable. February 8, 1250. 17 minutes of street fighting in Mansoura. That's when the Age of Crusades truly ended. Not when Acre fell 41 years later, that was just confirming what Baibars had proven in those narrow Egyptian streets. Heavy cavalry charging into prepared defenses doesn't win wars. Disciplined, mobile forces exploiting enemy weaknesses do. And 6,000 former slave soldiers taught that lesson to the most powerful Christian army ever assembled. Louis IX returned to France in 1254, broken and humiliated. 20 years later, he died pursuing the same failed dream. The Mamluks who destroyed him ruled Egypt for 267 years. And Jerusalem remained Muslim until 191766, 7 years later, when British forces captured it not through faith, but through superior logistics and modern warfare. Some lessons take centuries to learn. This one was written in blood and gold on the banks of the Nile.